Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the COVID-19 webinar by Tryon Medical Partners. And this is the April 14th session, which will be recorded and posted on the Tryon Direct website. I'm Patrick Brady, Senior Vice President at Tryon Direct, and I'm responsible for business outreach. As in the past, we have attendees today from across the state, and we welcome everyone, including those that have been with us before. As we get closer to the peak, which we've talked about many times on the webinar, we want you to know what to expect. And if anything, I hope you'd find us to be transparent in these discussions because we think you should know what we know. We encourage you strongly as we go through the content today to ask us questions. Either *6 if you're on the phone, or type in the chat box. We'll pick up on that. Dale is always happy to pause, take a question, answer it thoroughly, make sure we hit everything that you would like us to hit. And so this setting here and our COVID-19 task force through Tryon Direct, the website, tryondirect.com, is how we seek to serve you, the business community. So we have these sessions Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4:30 to 5:30, and then we also have the content, which is constantly updated on tryondirect.com. You see the agenda on the screen today, and Dale Owen, our CEO, practicing cardiologist, is going to share with you quite a bit of information today, but we're going to change it up. So this agenda, I'll call it all incremental updates, things that we've talked about. Perhaps there's some new things going on. We certainly want you to know that. But at the same time, there is an overwhelming sense that we get from you, from the market, that there's a lot of practical questions and doubts and uncertainty about how do we go about restarting this country, restarting this economy, restarting your business. And as best we can, because obviously we have a clinical perspective and we can share that with you in detail. As best we can, we want to help you think through that. And so today we're going to shift this up. The agenda that you see, we're going to go a little differently. This might be a shorter session. We don't know. It depends on your input to us and your questions. So again, we encourage you to definitely interact with us as we go throughout this. Also on the call today, we have Gaston Gage, our Chief Strategy Officer, Stephen Gage, PhD and organizational psychologist, Granger Pierce, labor attorney, and Thol Gill, our CFO. A little housekeeping before we jump in. The audio and slides for today will be posted to the Tryon Direct website tomorrow, the 15th. And we will take this format today based on your involvement with us, based on what you want to know. And Dale is going to take us through a number of things now. So Dale, I think with that, I am going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dale Owen. I'm the CEO of Tryon Medical Partners, and appreciate everybody's attention and jumping on today. We're basically, as Patrick said, scrapping a lot of the original outline because what we need to know and what is changing in front of us is what needs to be discussed today rather than a lot of basics, which we really need to assume most everybody has now. So we're going to talk about the rapidly changing landscape and peak and testing. And we're going to talk about a little U.S. history from 1918 and what we should have learned and what we have learned as a result of it. And lastly, we're going to talk about getting companies back on their feet and getting back to work. And what are the strategies behind that? So first of all, it is a rapidly changing foundation of what we're going through right now. As you know, in January was our first reported case in the United States. And look where we are now, almost 600,000 cases plus. And, death rate of about 3.9% in the U.S. higher in some other countries, lower in others. Lots of different variables causing it. But we do know a lot of things. Some of the most important stuff that we know right now is that our social distancing and quarantining and things of this nature are having a dramatic impact on the peak. Now, what does that mean, and what does that do for us? Well, let's take some practical approaches. Let's just talk about Mecklenburg County. I know everybody's not necessarily in Mecklenburg County, but let's use it because it is the highest incidence of the COVID virus positivity in the two states, North and South Carolina. So 3 weeks ago, we thought here in Mecklenburg County that we were going to need an additional 3,000 beds for COVID patients coming out of the hospital. And as a result, they were going to commandeer with the Army Corps of Engineers different places, and one was going to be UNCC, and 6 different dorms. Kids were told to come get all their stuff, take it out, so on and so forth. And they were going to need more ICU beds, and they also thought they were going to need to take over the convention center too. 2 weeks ago, and 3 weeks ago, they thought the peak was going to be literally today. 2 weeks ago, they thought the peak would be in late April, and that they weren't going to need quite as many beds as they thought, and quite as many ICU beds, and the concept of using UNCC was scrapped. Then, 1 week ago, we needed even fewer beds, to the point that last Saturday, 3 days ago, no additional beds are going to be needed in Mecklenburg County other than what could be put on campuses of the individual hospitals, potentially needing 100 ICU beds in addition to what they have right now. Now that is a massive change. And what it demonstrates to us, because this peak and the flattening has always been about a couple of variables. Could the hospital systems endure the true, real peak that was not mitigated by social distancing? The answer was no. What we've done with social distancing is we have allowed this peak to be smushed down, squashed down, and as a result of it, the peak's not going to be as high, and the hospital systems are going to have a much easier time. It's not going to be easy, but it's not going to be as hard, and it should be manageable with what the peak is going to be. What it also does is delays the peak. So what was initially today, 3 weeks ago, late April 2 weeks ago, mid-May last week, is by 3 out of 4 different models looking at mid to late May as the peak. Now there's good and bad to that. The good is that the hospital systems would be able to handle the peak and not have to take physicians out of retirement and put them back on the lines and so forth like that, which they were preparing to do, and we were all preparing for it. But what it also means is it delays the peak. And by pushing that peak down and spreading it out, it makes the peak or the broadening of that peak last longer as well. The concept of starting the country back up and opening everything up May 1st will happen before the peak occurs, and as a result will create a really significant second wave. We're going to have to wait until after this peak is over and a significant portion on the downside. And nobody likes the negative part of this flattening of the curve, knowing that the positive is that the hospitals can handle it. The negative is it's going to last longer. And most of the models are now going to be pushing this out past the end of June. So the peak flattens, but it broadens. And that broadening is sustained over a longer period of time. And as a result, we don't really see a tremendous change in things until after June. What we need is a vaccine to stop this. The vaccines will not be available the earliest 1 year, and most experts say at least a year and a half. I think we have to be honest with ourselves that we're going to see intermittent recurrences and resurgences of this virus unless there's a significant effect of heat and solar time on this virus, and we haven't seen that yet. We hope to, but if we don't, we're going to see recurrences. Let's talk a little bit about what happened in 1918. So the Spanish flu epidemic, and I've done a lot of reading about this, I think it's really fascinating because history has certainly repeated itself, and especially here in the United States. Woodrow Wilson, I believe, was the president at the time. He actually got sick from it. And one of the things that's been noticed about him afterwards is that after his illness was that his personality changed significantly. Decision-making wasn't impaired per se, but his personality was, and that apparently was one of the things that happened to a lot of people then. But here's the big deal. In 1918, the United States was late to quarantine compared to most other countries. In North Carolina, and especially in Mecklenburg County, schools closed and opened 4 separate times. As soon as they thought that they were over it, they opened the schools immediately. You had another recurrence. Everybody was sent back home. 4 times. And you know, we want to get the kids back into school, and that's a priority, and getting back to the workforce and so forth. And how to thread this needle is not easy. We had 600,000 deaths in the United States back in 1918 and 13,000 in North Carolina. Earlier today, I saw 111 had died in North Carolina from COVID. 13,000 back in 1918 from influenza, that epidemic and pandemic. And we were a rural state at the time. So we didn't really learn our lesson from what happened with the Spanish flu in 1918. We didn't quarantine early enough. And we're still trying to straddle this thing of economy versus lives saved. And let's be honest about it, that's exactly what we're talking about. So some practicality. We want to get back to work. Everybody wants to get back to work. We're all tired of looking at each other at home. I literally get home now and my family attacks me as I walk in the door wanting to know what real life is like because I'm allowed to leave to go see patients and they're staying at home. Now I have the most interesting thing going on. And that's a huge change in my family. So back to work. Let's take advantage of the types of tests that we have available. We know we have the PCR test. We've talked about that ad nauseum. And I won't go into the different types of PCR testing. That's for another time. We have PCR testing, we have antigen testing, we have antibody testing. Let's leave antigen testing out of it and let's go to antibody testing. And what does that tell you? The 2 different ones. PCR tells you people who have acute infection, and a lot of them are asymptomatic, so you pick up a lot of the asymptomatics. Antibody testing, specifically the IgM antibody, tests for somebody who has had the disease in the past. So if you're a business that is truly ultimately critical to the fabric and structure and function of the country, you need to know right now who's infected. Who do I have to take off the line right this minute because they're endangering over the next 10 days 8 more other people? Who do I have to get out of the line? And that's a good strategy for the people who have those types of critical fabric of the country needs. But even for those companies, soon after this peak, they're going to want to be testing for antibodies and find out who's also been infected in the past over it and can stay at work, presumably so. For the other employers across the nation, which is the vast majority, even the essential, a combination of PCR and antibody testing is probably the most prudent thing to do. The antibody test, if positive, you get to send those people back to work. If negative, they might be an asymptomatic person and they might need the PCR test to know whether or not they are carrying it and asymptomatic. If they're positive, you send them home for 14 days and then come back in 14. If they're completely well and no fever for 3 days and so forth. But if those PCR tests are negative, which many will be, now the question is, what type of a retesting policy do I need? That's going to be the issue. So number one, the truly critical companies to the fabric of the country, where when they go down, function across the country goes down. Those people need to know who they've got that's positive right now and get them out of there. All the other groups, when we start getting back to work, they need an antibody test, and those who are positive, hooray, they've had it before, and they've done well, survived it, and then go back to work. There's some subtleties to that we need some more data on, which we won't go into right now. But those who are antibody negative, question is, should they get the PCR test done to prove that they are not infected? Because you don't want to send everybody back and you've got 10 people who are asymptomatic and haven't showed their first symptoms yet, and they go spread it to all of your workforce that hasn't been exposed to it yet, because that's what will happen. And you need the PCR negative test to be able to know that somebody can go back to work and stay there, and if they're positive, you get them out of there. Keep them from infecting everybody else. Then you need to have a retesting policy so that those folks who didn't practice this way don't infect your labor force. And if they do, you identify them quickly and can isolate them, quarantine them very fast, and be very proactive to be able to keep your businesses going. With that, I'll stop there and answer questions and talk generalities or specifics.
Yep, that's a great place to stop. Now I'm watching the chat and I do not see any questions, but we do want to take a pause here for a minute. Anybody with a question, please type in the chat window and we can field those. How about on the phone? So *6, anybody that wants to jump in? Okay. All right, we'll give it just a few more seconds, Dale, and then we can move on. All right, so first question. What is the best way to get your essential business set up with these tests?
What is the best way to get your what business?
Your essential business set up with these tests.
All right. It's not complex. It's not complex, but what it is it has to be very well coordinated. The coordination is to have labs that can do antibody testing that's reputable, reliable, has a lot of bandwidth, because meaning that they can do a lot of tests and answer them. You know, somebody who can do 1,000 tests a day when they have 50,000 people trying to get tests with them, they're going to get overwhelmed real quickly. So we've got to identify the antibody folks, people who do the antibody test, who can scale up significantly and be able to do this in great bulk on a daily basis. You also need quick turnaround. So somebody who can promise turnaround of 5 days versus 1 day, obviously the 1 day people win. Hours instead of 1 day beats that. And so different companies are going to have different capabilities. So you got to have a company with great bandwidth, a very reliable test, and can scale tremendously. And we're investigating all those people literally as we speak. Number two, you're still going to need a PCR antibody, a PCR test that can give you information quickly. So let's talk about these PCR tests. Some of these PCR testing groups can have things back in 24 hours, 36 hours, things like that. If you remember, the Abbott test is a PCR test that can have positivity back in 5 minutes, negativity in 13 minutes. But here's the problem: scalability. They can't scale it fast enough, and they're sending it to the wrong places of the country. They're sending it where everybody's positive rather than where people are less likely to be positive, where a positive test really means much more and can isolate those people faster. So, and prevent spread. So Abbott right now is not a solution. I hope they will be soon, but probably for several weeks, if not months, according to some authorities, they won't be ready for that. You need a PCR test that can do it within 24 hours, as I mentioned. Some of the largest labs in the country still are reporting 4 to 5 day turnaround. That's not good enough. What they are doing is they are prioritizing in-hospital patients. Appropriate to prioritize them, and they're giving them 1 day turnaround. And that's happening in labs all over the country, not just the largest labs, but the folks that are helping hospitals feel an obligation, appropriately so, to continue to do the hospitals first. I think that most people know, have a pretty good idea, darn good idea when they come in and what the chest x-ray looks like and labs look like, and interleukin-6 being positive and so forth, that that's COVID, and a positive test might not really help them that much. So you need a lab that can turn it around quickly. I'm hoping that the large labs will be able to scale to that degree, but right now they're prioritizing in-hospital patients.
You know, we have a part two to that, and this is a little more practical question. Is TriMedical going to be able to provide the test for employers? So I'd say provide, maybe administer as well.
What we're going to do is we're going to provide a formula and capability to bring the scalability to our clients, and with the right people. I don't care where they are in the country, we'll fly the darn things across the United States if they can give us better turnaround time with reliability. So, you know, if they're local, great. But if they're local and they give us 6-day turnaround time versus somebody in Arkansas or New Mexico that gives us 1-day turnaround time, you can imagine where these tests are going. So it's scalability and yes, and reliability. And yes, we will provide a formula and a package to be able to do all of those things.
Dale, I'll add one thing to that, and this, you can comment on this. It is a good thing for business that the tests are rapidly being rolled out in terms of being incrementally better than the ones before them. What do you see, Dale, over the next week, 2 weeks? You mentioned scale. You mentioned being able to do a large number of tests in a short window of time. How do you see this continuing to unfold in the next few weeks as far as tests and effectiveness and deployment, being able to get these en masse out in society so that the testing can happen broadly?
Okay, well, let's first start with a single statement that the federal government inhibited that ability for other labs to do this and to create these own LTDs, LDTs, lab determined tests, and then to apply and so forth through the FDA for emergency use application and such, EUA. So that being aside, things are changing very rapidly. Different tests are becoming more widely known across the country. Some today, some Friday, some that we hear might be coming forward and so forth. I'll tell you what we really need is but another company similar to GM, instead just ventilators, somebody to scale the proper test rapidly. Because all of these mom and pop organizations, and that's a little bit broad statement, they're not these behemoth labs. They're small labs, and they don't have a lot of infrastructure, but they're nimble, and they can develop a test really quickly. But they don't have the infrastructure to scale it like the big behemoth labs do. So each one has its own capability that helps the other. I'd love to see some of these smaller labs joined with a larger scalability lab that can just produce the heck out of this thing quickly across the United States. And then we would see what we need to see. But I anticipate that there's going to be a lot of pivoting, because what's the next best thing comes out 1 week might be the greatest, test of all. But if we can't deliver it, it doesn't matter how good it is. That's our problem. It's been delivery. We've got tons of bright people all over the world developing great tests, but then they can't scale it fast enough. And we don't have big business jumping in and putting billions of dollars into a small company that has a phenomenal test and force the issue of getting this out to the public. That's what's needed.
All right, good point to stop and check the chat. I don't see any questions there. So on the phone, anybody have any questions? *6 if you do, and jump into the chat, please, if you want to be in this particular part of the discussion, because this is where it typically comes back when we hear it from business. It is right here. Well, what about X? Fill in the blank. X being whatever test has just hit the media. Great, great publicity, but a lot of the practical detail is missing. And so clinically, what Dale's trying to do is give you his best interpretation of what that means for you, your employees, your community. So I'll go one more time and see if there are any questions. All right, Dale, I will.
Let me say a
let
couple
you
things.
continue.
Let me say a couple things. Number one, there is a formula to be able to get back to work. It involves timing and threading the needle. We need to learn from what happened in 1918. We need to learn that if we open up too early, we're going to be right back on our rear ends, right back at home again. We can do something that makes us feel good right now, but it's going to hurt us in the long run because we're going to get these recurrent peaks again. So let's learn from what happened in the past. Number two, there is a formula that when we're ready to go back to work, that's going to involve different tests in combination with each other. And what I'm hoping, ethically and morally and physically and emotionally, is that the volume of these tests drives down the cost of them as well too. We all need to see that. We need to see the scalability. We need to see companies putting the whole country as the priority first to rapidly scale these tests and test the nation. It's hard to do, over 300 million people. But we do have a lot of wherewithal to do this type of thing, because where it's going to have its greatest effect is the degree of the second peak. There will always be some type of a second peak. You cannot avoid it, because there will always be somebody who didn't have a positive test or who has the disease and hadn't had their symptoms yet, and they'll leak back out into the public. But that's where the PCR testing, catching these people early, isolates them quickly, and we limit this second peak that will come, but we want it to be very small. But there's no preventing the second peak. It's what degree it's going to be. And so number one, learn from the past. Don't open too early. But when we open, let's open effectively by knowing who really does and doesn't have it, and retest these people to prevent this second peak, which can be damaging both physically and financially to the country.
All right, and I think that's a good bow around the package that Dale has given us today. I want to see if there's any additional comment, and we've got one. Okay, good. Granger Pierce is on the phone, and this, Granger, is for you. Says, I'd like to hear from you about implementing the tests in compliance with employment laws.
Okay. I mean, in terms of that's a good question. And in terms of how you might want to implement these tests to comply with employment laws, I think, you know, number one, if you're going to be testing indiscriminately and just testing everybody, then obviously you want to test everybody. You don't want to single out a particular group based on any kind of a protected characteristic. In terms of testing folks who are exhibiting signs and symptoms, the EEOC has pretty much in guidance that they've published on these issues deferred to the CDC on a lot of these aspects, and they're not going to be, from the standpoint of like an ADA concern or something like that, there really aren't going to be any if you're just looking to, you know, test folks who are exhibiting, you know, signs and symptoms. But in terms of, like I said, in terms of just if you're going to be testing broad spectrum, it's just like any other, from an HR standpoint, like anything else, you're going to want to do it. You're going to want to be consistent in your application and not single folks out based on protected characteristics.
All right, and
Hey, Granger,
Yes.
This is Dale Owen. Let me follow up on that and ask you a different portion of that same question. That's assuming that the current laws exist the way they are now, why wouldn't the federal and state governments relax those things to try and get people tested once a appropriate program is understood? Why wouldn't they relax that to make it much easier to get this country moving?
That's actually a really good question, Dale, and it's not really. I don't think it's there anything that really needs to be relaxed. It's perfectly fine to test as long as you're just testing consistently across the board. So by that I mean you wouldn't want to test. When I say testing on a protected characteristic, I mean you wouldn't want to say, okay, we're only going to test, we're only going to test Latinos, or we're only going to test women, or we're only going to test this particular protected group. As long as you're saying we're going to test, or we're only going to test folks who are 40 and over, or something like that. But in terms of doing broad scale testing, I think it's fine to do that. And the EEOC has indicated, and this is just again kind of reading between the lines in some of their guidance, that they're going to be. I think it's pretty safe to assume they're going to be fairly hands off in that, and in the unlikely event, we were to see discrimination charges filed by folks who claim they were tested in a discriminatory manner. And this is again just based on my experience with no specific set of facts in front of me. I think it's fairly unlikely they're going to get much traction on something like that.
So we have a part 2 to this. Drug tests must comply with specific state laws. Those don't exist around this. Granger, you might have covered most of that, but you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, if there's I can't speak to, without having the statute right in front of me, the controlled substance examination regulation, in terms of drug testing, I'm not sure off the top of my head whether this would constitute a drug test under the controlled substance examination regulation, but to the extent it did, all you'd have to do would be to make the required disclosures and have the employee sign the required paperwork. So, I mean, I can't, in terms of how new this stuff is, I can't guess or speculate about some of that stuff, but I'm not real concerned based on what I've seen from the EEOC so far on testing and dealing with controlling the spread of this in the workplace. They've taken a very hands-off approach and really been very deferential to the to the CDC. So if and to the extent something like that comes up, I wouldn't be too concerned about that.
Okay, thank you for that, Granger.
Sure.
All right, we're going to give it another minute or two here, and Dale, I'll give you a minute to make any wrap-up comments. I mean, as I said at the outset, this was very specific, and we felt very strongly that this was the content, the practical type of feedback that we're getting that we wanted to bring out to this group. So we don't feel like we need to keep you the whole hour. We want you to get out of it what you want, but I think we're wrapping up all the thoughts that Dale has talked about. On the phone, anybody, *6, jump in please if you have a question. Okay, in the chat, anybody? Granger, for you, thank you for the info. And the charts, by the way, that you see coming up on the screen, those will be in the slides that we send out tomorrow, and it'll be with the audio as well. Okay, anybody else? All right, Dale, I'll let you wrap up if there's anything else that you want to add here at the end.
Well, in the past, we've talked about let's being all together, lock arms, and do this social distancing. Right? We've had great effect. But let's learn from the past. We have a great example with lots of information of the mistakes we made 100 years ago. Let's don't make them again. It's going to be hurtful in lives, economic issues as well. But we also we're going to try and thread this needle at the appropriate time. We may not get it exactly right, and it's going to be our best guess. But let's not be hasty like we were in 1918. And then let's have the back to work programs developed on appropriate testing. And we're actually in the process, well into the process of developing this now as to how we want to proceed and recommend to clients and to others what are the appropriate ways to handle this. And then third, let's be malleable and realize that nobody knows everything about this. And let's all be open-minded that when something comes up and it's a better way to handle it, that we can pivot and scale it to what's the best thing for the country. And I think that that's the most important. Is that it's not about just the individual now. This is one of the times where it's about all of us. And everybody doing the right thing for everyone else is going to be more important now than any time in our lifetimes. Thank you.
I like that, Dale. That's the balance that I think we're talking about here, that you're hearing a lot of different perspectives nationally, locally, and that's just wrapping up everything that we see. Everything that we see, and clinically what it is that we expect and how we can continue on the recovery. So with that, Dale, thank you very much. Granger, Stephen, Gaston, everybody that has joined in for the webinar. For all of you on the line on the webinar, we appreciate you very much that you are interested in this content. We hope it's timely for you. We will get this posted out to Tryon Direct, and I wish you all a great afternoon.